Critical meeting with British Prime Minister Boris Johnson ahead of the G7 summit. It is Biden's first overseas test as diplomat-in-chief. In the coming days, the president taking on a very familiar role on the international stage, albeit with a new title, as he looks to restore U.S. allies' faith in America as a partner and a leading democracy.
At every point along the way, we're going to make it clear that the United States is back, and democracies of the world are standing together to tackle the toughest challenges and the issues that matter most to our future.
The focus for Biden, a big focus, is zeroing in on reestablishing the international community's respect, particularly in the wake of former President Trump's go-it-alone America First approach. But the president's biggest meeting will not come until next week. That is when he sits down face-to-face with Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Biden already sending a clear message that his relationship with the Russian leader will be very different from his predecessors. This as Putin delivers a message of his own. There is clearly a lot to get to. Our team is following all of the developments unfolding overseas. Let's begin with CNN Chief National Affairs Correspondent Jeff Zeleny in Falmouth, England. Jeff, good morning. Good afternoon to you. President Biden meets with Prime Minister Johnson later today. What can we expect?
Good morning, Poppy. This is, of course, the first meeting between President Biden and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, so they certainly will be beginning their own relationship. The two countries have a special relationship, but it's also the relationship of and the dynamics of individual leaders that really enlivens the country's relationship. But we got a sense from President Biden as he arrived here last evening, talking to American troops about the importance of democracy and why democracies around the world also so important as the rise of as autocrats are certainly happening. So listen to what President Biden said that really sets the tone for the rest of his week here.
We have to discredit those who believe that the age of democracy is over, as some of our fellow nations believe. We have to expose as false the narrative that decrees of dictators can match the speed and scale of the 21st challenges.
So really putting into historical context there the challenges that are set for him and Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So just taking a look now at a couple of things on his itinerary for the rest of the day here. He and Prime Minister Boris Johnson are going to review the Atlantic Charter and revise that. This is, of course, a document some 80 years old this year, reached with FDR and Winston Churchill back in the, really set the course of things after the Second World War. This is going to be updated for this age. Talking to White House officials this morning, they tell us that this is going to be talking about the new threats, not necessarily in a new Cold War sense, but talking about the other threats and challenges facing these two countries, but also in this face-to-face meeting, it is going to give the president and the prime minister a chance to really reset their relationship. You'll remember during the 2020 campaign, at the time, Joe Biden, not a fan of Boris Johnson. He called him a clone of Donald Trump. That is an entirely new dynamic that is going to be starting today. So we'll see them face-to-face for the first time. And, of course, later today, President Biden will be talking about the vaccines, those 500 million vaccines the U.S. is buying for other countries. Jim and Poppy.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if Biden is reminded of his description of Johnson in the past while he's there. CNN's Nick Robertson also in the UK. So Nick, this is the time that Biden is sitting down with friends. Next week, he's going to sit down with an adversary, with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Geneva. We're going to be there for that. State Department condemning Russia's decision to designate opposition groups affiliated with Alexei Navalny as extremists. I wonder, what message is Putin sending to Biden with this move in advance of their face-to-face meeting?
I think when you evaluate President Putin over the last number of years, he got to feel under President Trump that he could get away with whatever he wanted. And he appears to be set on trying the same game with President Biden. Now, President Biden is saying that when he gets to sit down with him, he's going to tell him what he wants him, President Putin, to know.
I'm heading to the G7, then to the NATO ministerial event, to meet with Mr. Putin to let him know what I want him to know.
So this meeting between them is about not about friendship. White House officials say it's going to be candid, and it is to provide at the end of it a stable relationship, a predictable, stable relationship. That's certainly something the United States allies are going to look for. But one of the issues that may very well come up is that topic that, Jim, that you just mentioned. Alexei Navalny and his group, the State Department, have issued a very robust and strong statement on that, and I'm going to read it to you right now. With this action, Russia has effectively criminalized one of the country's few remaining independent political movements. We urge Russia to cease the abuse of extremism designations, to target non-violent organizations, end its repression against Mr. Navalny and his supporters, and honor its international obligations to respect and ensure human rights and fundamental freedoms. That message from the State Department and what President Biden has to say privately behind those closed doors are central to his standing internationally, that he says that he is a champion for democracy, that we must defend democracy in the face of autocracies, that this is essentially an historic pivot moment for the world. And that's what President Putin can expect to hear from him.
And we'll see if that messaging changes Russia's behavior. Still a test, still a question. Jeff Zeleny, Nick Robertson, thanks very much to both of you. Joining us now to speak more about this morning's meeting, the challenges, the goals for Biden, CNN chief political correspondent Dana Bash. And Dana, if we could begin with this Johnson-Biden meeting, interesting, maybe awkward, diplomatically as well, because Johnson deliberately allied himself with Trump, fellow populists. Trump supported Brexit. Of course, that's something that Johnson championed. Now there's a new sheriff in town. Is that a bridgeable gap for those two leaders?
It is a bridgeable gap because President Biden understands that it is not just about personalities. It's not just about how and what the particular prime minister campaigned on or what he stands for when it comes to his domestic or even in European politics. It's about this so-called special relationship that we have been covering since we first started covering politics, and even before that. I was looking back and remembering, Jim, it was almost exactly 20 years ago that George W. Bush, the White House I covered, went and met for the first time with Tony Blair, and they bonded over Colgate toothpaste. You remember that? Yeah. I don't expect there to be a Colgate toothpaste moment here, but there were questions then about whether the two of them could get together. And then look what happened. For better or worse, they became linked to one another.
Yep.
So there is going to be presented later today a new Atlantic Charter. And obviously this harkens back to FDR. But what's different this time, and what's notable, and our colleague Stephen Collinson pointed out this morning, is that even FDR didn't have to face sort of the unraveling democratic values at home when he was crossing the Atlantic that time, right? And so Biden faces this unique challenge of having to present the United States as renewed, refreshed, united overseas, while domestically this all remains at home.
That's right, and it's all about having moral authority. At the end of the day, because, as I mentioned, whether it was Bush, who certainly had his problems on the world stage, particularly as the Iraq War happened and then went bad, he did have that moral authority on something as so basic that none of us ever even questioned it, which is his respect for the institutions of democracy here in the United States. And that is something that President Biden certainly has the respect for, but he doesn't, have the ability to say that it is rock solid, the way that almost every president before him has had. And so meetings that he goes into, never mind in the short term at the G7, but more importantly with Vladimir Putin, other presidents, his predecessors, have been able to say, don't backslide on democracy. Don't do things like calling your opposition an extremist organization, because that is not the way democracies work. Vladimir Putin can turn to him and say, really, you're going to lecture me about democracy because you had an insurrection at the United States Capitol? Again, that's certainly not Joe Biden's fault, but it makes it more difficult.
Imagine those circumstances that U.S. allies have to encourage America, not to backslide on democracy. I mean, that's the reality in 2021. It's remarkable.
Yeah,
I do want to ask, do partners believe that message, right? Because one thing that Trump changed is that things that used to be bipartisan approaches to the world, commitment to NATO, for instance, the friendship with the UK, and so on, that changed under Trump. And of course, world leaders might look and say, well, in 2024, you could have a Trump-like Republican, or maybe Trump himself come back. I mean, do they believe this message from Biden is lasting?
I don't know that they can believe it's lasting, but there's little question that they will be welcoming it, at least in the short term. And now, really more than ever, because it's not just autocratic regimes popping up and doing better well, not that there's an autocratic regime in America, but there certainly was an autocratic tendency here, and it's happening around the globe. So at least in the short term, time is of the essence, because as we hear from President Biden, and it was one of the first things that he said about his foreign policy, he looked to China. And Jim, you know this better than the other two of us in this conversation, that his number one goal is to make sure that the United States and other democracies are competitive with China. That is really urgent. And if he can at least establish the baseline for that in the next 4 years, that will be a short-term success.
Dana, thank you so much. We have a lot ahead this hour still to come. FDA advisors are meeting right now. They're talking about authorizing COVID-19 vaccine shots for children. The White House is set to make a really big announcement, a major contribution to the global vaccination effort. President Biden will soon announce that the U.S. has purchased and will donate 500 million doses of Pfizer's COVID vaccine around the world.
A major change from the previous administration. CNN senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen joins us now. So, Elizabeth, how do you distribute 500 million doses of vaccine to the world?
Goods get distributed all over the world all the time. For the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, they have to take special care with temperature. But, this is the kind of things that shippers are used to doing. What's so great about this is that this administration recognizes that you have to vaccinate the world. The virus knows no national boundaries. So even though things are looking much better in the United States, there is ample vaccine. All you need is for it to be spreading around the world, for a variant to emerge that could really get us all, and that would be terrible. And so you should really vaccinate the world. So let's take a look at what the plan is for getting vaccine to these lower income countries. So we're talking about 92 low and lower middle income countries. In August, vaccine will start shipping, and then by the end of the year, 200 million doses will be delivered. And in the first half of next year, the remaining 300 million doses will be delivered, because again, viruses don't know national boundaries. So yes, is this an act of charity? Yes, but it's also a way of protecting Americans. Jim, Poppy?
Elizabeth, thank you very much. It will be very welcome, I know, around the world. Let's bring in, to discuss this and a lot more, Dr. Mark McClellan, the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy. He's a former FDA commissioner, now serves on the board of Johnson & Johnson. So a lot to get to on all these fronts with you. Could you speak to the impact you expect this to have? The United States, 500 million doses, as Jim said. But I would suspect we need other wealthy nations with an excess of vaccine to do the same.
Poppy, we do need more. This is a really important step. We've developed and have available here in the United States some very effective and safe vaccines. You can see what a difference it's made in the pandemic. Unfortunately, the rest of the world, especially low and middle income countries, including the 92 that are getting these vaccines, are in a very different position with COVID still surging. So this is an important step, but we have a lot more vaccines that we need to provide in the range of billions of doses. And on top of that, as Elizabeth said, we can get the vaccines to countries where they're needed, but just as in the United States, there are challenges in getting from there the vaccines out into people's arms and overcoming issues like confidence and hesitancy around the vaccines. There's still a lot of work to do there around the world. So this is the first step, and hopefully the G7 meeting that's taking place now can add to it.
So there are also, on top of this donation of Pfizer vaccine, there are up to millions, Dr. McClellan, of J&J vaccine sitting on shelves about to expire this month. I ask you this as someone who sits on the board of J&J. That is beyond frustrating to people around the world and governments that need any vaccine that they can get. The CEO of J&J said this week, look, we're working very hard on a federal level, on a local level, to do what we can to make sure that these vaccines are deployed in the most meaningful way. Can you give us some insight into what's going to happen? I mean, as someone who sits on that board, are you confident that these vaccines are not just going to go to waste?
Well, I certainly hope so. They're so important, especially for people who can't make it back for 2 doses and want a one-shot solution. What we're finding, Poppy, is that now that we're getting further into the availability of vaccines, we don't really know how long these vaccines can last on the shelf. The J&J vaccine is one that you can refrigerate for a long time, but as part of this emergency, we weren't able to take the time to see just how long they could last. So those studies are ongoing now. As you heard, J&J is working with the FDA to try to provide the information needed to get confidence about just how long they can last. And that's a really important issue since that could lead to more availability of vaccines here. But Poppy, it also goes back to the point about sharing the doses outside the U.S. We really need to work that out.
I guess that's what I'm wondering, is as you test whether the J&J vaccine can be refrigerated for more than 3 months, and therefore you could keep it in the U.S. longer for other folks, it seems to me like J&J would like to ship these doses or see them shipped out from states, from the federal government to other countries, but there is, legal red tape, logistical tape that might prevent that?
That's right. First off, the U.S. and other countries that have gotten these excess supplies of really good vaccines are doing it for a reason. They want to be ready for contingencies like variants that may be more resistant, the need for booster shots. That's understandable. But we're now seeing not just the J&J. In the months ahead, we've projected hundreds of millions of excess doses here in the United States, similarly coming in Western European countries, the other members of the G7. That could add hundreds of millions of doses, maybe 1 billion doses this year to the shots that could be available around the world. And there are logistics to work out, legal issues and so forth. That's something we need to work on right now. The U.S. has started to do this with a small number of doses, 25 million already, 80 million next month. We need to ramp that up, and hopefully that's something that the U.S. and other countries that have benefited from these vaccines can do to accelerate the end of the pandemic.
We certainly hope so. It would be such a tragedy to see those go to waste. Let's end on this. You wrote a really interesting op-ed a few days ago, and you are someone who has organized what is called a COVID Commission Planning Group. But here's what you write in the Washington Post. The Senate's rejection of a bill to create a commission to investigate the January 6th attack on the Capitol may discourage many about the prospects for a nonpartisan investigation of this pandemic. It shouldn't. And you add, if simplistic narratives about the pandemic are allowed to prevail, the world will be woefully ill-prepared for the next virus. What is your warning if we don't have this commission that you want?
Poppy, this has been such an all-encompassing pandemic that's had so many impacts throughout our society. Some things have gone well. We were just talking about how effective the vaccines that the U.S. government backed in the last administration and this one have turned out to be. Some things have gone not so well, detecting the cases early and so forth. So this is not a partisan issue. This is the biggest public health emergency we face in a century. And just like in other major emergencies, there are so many opportunities to learn. We have the technology, we have the ability to prepare so that this sort of thing should never happen again, but we need to look deeply, and we need to do it with science, with people from all sides coming together.
I hope a lot of folks heed that warning. Dr. McClellan, thank you.
Good to be with you.
Well, just an alarming surge in
just released transcripts of his closed-door testimony, former White House counsel Don McGahn tells Congress he felt trapped, his word, under former President Trump.
Yeah, McGahn says that he called one of Trump's requests, quote, a point of no return, relates to the firing of Robert Mueller. Lauren Fox live on Capitol Hill this morning. Lauren, I mean, this was an essential question, is why, by the way, Democratic lawmakers were seeking McCann's testimony during the Trump administration. Blocked. Finally, it happens. But tell us the significance of that.
Well, this has been a 2-year court battle, and this testimony behind closed doors, of course, reveals some of what we already knew, which is that the Mueller report was accurate, that this was McGahn was someone, of course, who testified 5 different times before Mueller's counsel and his team. And I think that one of the things you have to keep in mind about this testimony is that this really reveals that he viewed being asked to pressure Rod Rosenstein to go ahead and try to fire Robert Mueller as really a point of no return. Like you said, he also viewed this as just being a difficult place to be in, that he thought working for President Trump was becoming more and more difficult, especially because he felt like sometimes he was being used not just as the White House counsel, but also the president's personal lawyer. And that obviously is an uncomfortable place to be, because that is not the role of the White House counsel. He's sort of laid out in more detail exactly why he felt like he was so uncomfortable in what the president, or former President Donald Trump, was asking him to do. I want to read you part of the excerpt from this closed door testimony. He says, quote, "If acting attorney general received what he thought was a direction from the counsel to the president to remove a special counsel, he would either have to remove the special counsel or resign," McGahn said. "We are still talking about the Saturday Night Massacre decades and decades later." And of course, he is referring to that critical moment in the Nixon administration, something that he argued he did not want to happen under his watch. And I think that this was really just a culmination of this bigger fight that Democrats have been having to try to prove exactly what was going on when former President Trump was in office. Jim and Poppy?
It's a remarkable revelation, right? Another Saturday Night Massacre, and, frankly, attempt at least. Lauren Fox on the Hill, thanks so much. Well, the U.S. Capitol Police Union is now calling for the resignation of the acting chief, Yogananda Pittman, and the senior leadership, who they say, in their words, failed them.
So this call for resignation comes after 2 Senate committees released this report, you'll remember earlier this week, outlining evidence of intelligence failures, critical miscommunications, and unheeded warnings. Our Whitney Wild joins us now. Whitney, good morning to you. Where does this go from here?
Well, that's anybody's guess. So the process on the Hill right now is that they are looking for a new police chief. That process is well underway. Applications were actually submitted by possible applicants through May 17th. So now you'd expect that they're in the phase where they're actually assessing possible applicants. So the question is, are these leadership members at Capitol Police going to keep their jobs? And that is the open question. The union has been very involved in, the selection for the new chief. They were actually directed by Congress. The people searching for the chief were directed by Congress to say, hey, you really need to make sure that you're talking to the rank and file officers and get them involved in this process to find the best possible applicant. So the union now calling for acting chief Yogananda Pittman's resignation, as well as others. This, Jim and Poppy, actually comes after they had done this vote of no confidence, a story CNN first reported many, many months ago. So they have been actively critical of her for months now following this January 6th insurrection. Here's what they're saying in this most recent press release. The time has come for those in senior leadership who failed us to stand aside. It is not enough to scapegoat others. Those most responsible, including acting Chief Pittman, who was in charge of intelligence prior to the insurrection, need to step aside for the good of the department. As a Senate report found, our leadership failed us, and we paid a horrible price. Jim and Poppy, again, highly critical of their leadership. So, the question is, as the Capitol Police Board assesses these candidates for police chief, we know Yogananda Pittman has put in for that. What kind of weight this is going to have in those conversations, that's something that we'll probably learn a lot more about in the next couple weeks.
Yep.
Okay, Whitney Wild with the reporting in Washington. Thank you, Whitney. Well, a new report out.
The NFL season is starting up again in September, which is, that's fun to say, right? It's wonderful to say. It's getting back to normal. But here's the thing. The league does not require players to be vaccinated. So those who are vaccinated will largely return to pre-pandemic normal at work. That's not enough to convince some players, including Carolina Panthers quarterback Sam Darnold.
I haven't been vaccinated yet. Still got to think about, all those certain things that go into it. Again, it's everyone's choice, whether they want to get vaccinated or not.
So Washington defensive end Montez Sweat said this after his team's coach invited a vaccine expert to speak with players. Quote, "I'm not a fan of it. I probably won't get vaccinated until I get more facts and all that type of stuff. I'm not a fan of it at all. I haven't caught COVID yet. I don't see me treating COVID until I actually get COVID." I want to bring in CNN chief medical correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta. That's not necessarily a very forward-looking strategy there, Sanjay.
No, I mean, obviously the vaccine is so that you don't get it. That's the whole point. It's not to treat it after the fact, but you're trying to avoid it. I always think it's important to give context here when we're talking about, the NFL in this case, or we were talking about Houston Methodist Hospital yesterday. The vast majority of people are getting vaccinated. 30 out of 32 teams in the NFL, 90% plus of their players and staff are vaccinated, and the numbers are still going up. And the other two teams, 80% plus. So these are the exceptions that we're talking about. And as you point out, the vaccines are encouraged, but not mandated for the NFL teams. But you don't have to get daily testing. You don't have to wear masks. You can eat in cafeterias. You can work out in the weight rooms. There's different travel restrictions that are lifted if you've been vaccinated. So there's all these incentives for people to go ahead and get vaccinated. Let me just show you quickly, if I can, the country as a whole, like where we stand 6 or so months into this vaccination campaign. About 3 out of 5, 66% roughly of people have either been vaccinated or say they're going to go ahead and get vaccinated. 1 out of 5 sort of on the fence still, sort of in that wait and see mode. And then 1 out of 5 basically saying they're not planning on doing it. They're not going to do it for all sorts of different reasons. Concerns about safety, concerns that I don't really need it, transportation, cost, whatever it may be, all these different things. And then we just put together this other graphic just quickly because, again, we're getting more data. What does this look like across the country? Who are most likely to not get vaccinated? It's a busy graphic there, but this data basically shows that younger people living in rural areas, people who are more conservative, those are the sort of qualities of people who are less likely at this point to get vaccinated.
It's really interesting to look at those contrasts. If you study the bottom, that makes it a little less chaotic, right? Look at that. Look at what the lettering on the bottom says there. I want to ask you about Moderna asking the FDA to okay its COVID-19 vaccine for 12 to 17-year-olds. The idea being here that there would be more options than just Pfizer.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, this is not necessarily a supply issue. I think to your point, Brianna, we have plenty of supply. In fact, yesterday we were all talking about the fact that there may be unused vaccine out there. This is probably more of a trust issue. Look what's happening here. There's already been a vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine that's been approved, authorized for that age group, and now another one's being authorized. So the preponderance of sort of the data is on the side of these vaccines work, they're getting authorized. So maybe it'll help with that trust issue.
What about people younger than 12, Sanjay?
Yeah, that is the question, and it's interesting. There's going to be a big meeting. The committee is going to meet today, a pre-meeting, if you will, to sort of say, hey, look, what do we really want to see in terms of the data for younger people? One of the big questions is going to be dosing. So Pfizer, for example, if you got the Pfizer vaccine, you got 30 micrograms. For people between the ages of 5 and 11, it's going to be a lower dose. They're looking at probably 10 micrograms, but they're not sure yet. And a lower dose than that, even 3 micrograms for people who are younger. That's going to be a big question. But I think a more fundamental issue with these younger age groups is a pretty simple one. We know they are less likely to get sick. We know they are less likely to get infected. Not that there's still a risk there, but it's a lower risk. So how do you then balance that with the authorization? What is the level of evidence you're going to need given that the risk is lower? And that's an important discussion that's going to happen. You remember with the 12 to 15-year-olds, they basically said, hey, look, it works for 16-year-old plus. It's going to pretty much be the same in this age group. We just want to make sure they're producing enough antibodies. For younger kids, I think the level of evidence is going to be higher in terms of safety and efficacy.
Yeah, look, that's the thing. I'm looking at a summer. The mosquitoes are already out. How do we get together with our friends? I've got a 3 and a 5-year-old. How do we get together with our friends who have kids the same age? We would normally want to be inside, right? maybe that's not the best idea. If the case rate is low enough, what do we do? It's, it'd be so much easier if there was a vaccine, Sanjay.
Yeah, I know. I definitely know. I mean, we had the same discussion. My girls are 12 to 15, as you know, Brianna. I feel for you. They just got their second shots this past Monday. So, were they worried about getting sick? Not so much. That wasn't the big concern in the front of their minds. It was exactly what you're talking about, the doors that are potentially going to be open for them. So people, Brianna, are working on it. They think possibly by September, so 2.5 to 3 months maybe from now. I know that's not going to be in time for the summer, Brianna, for you and your kids, but it's happening. I mean, it's still extraordinary that a year ago we weren't possibly even imagining this idea that we would have